kind of start with here. So welcome to the second of the 2 weekend sessions for Unit 4. It was big enough that it really needed to be broken up into two. And that's kind of what I was just touching on there, is that the way I decided to approach this is, instead of trying to incorporate those bits randomly into the last one, it just didn't really make sense as I was trying to do it. It was kind of confusing. So I've kind of included them in here and tried to incorporate things in a way that kind of makes the most sense, I guess is what I would say. But remember, this is review, so some of it is going to be redundant from class, but that's the whole kind of point of review. But I expand on a few things, and also I've added in some context, mostly around kind of the powers in Europe that I think the AP curriculum is missing, that I think is valuable for you guys to kind of understand this period in time better. And that kind of touches on what I'm trying to say here. These slides, of course, are a minimum, but also the CED in and of itself is a minimum. So it does, kind of establish kind of a baseline of what you'll need to know when we're talking about like multiple choice, and even on the kind of LEQ as well, to an extent, the SAQs. The DBQ is a little bit different, but obviously pulling in your own evidence beyond the facts is where this stuff will come in handy for you. But even then, the CED can't possibly cover all of human history, and that's kind of the challenge in learning this, is learning enough without throwing so much at you that there's too much to know, but enough that everything really makes sense. So again, remember, Unit 4 is all centered around these 5 empires: Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, or the Dutch, Britain, or the English, and the French. And these are the 5 that really start spreading out across the world and kind of taking over the world during this period in time. And so I'm going to start with kind of just a real quick overview of them again, just to kind of refresh you, and then get into some other people in this time that aren't the central kind of characters or the central actors of Unit 4. But I think it's important that we talk about, just like last time how we talked about Russia, even though Russia is not mentioned kind of anywhere here. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about some other European powers that we have mentioned, but I think they merit some specific discussion to better kind of put these things in the context next to each other. So remember, Portugal were the ones that got that going first in terms of the expansion outward into really the Americas, but also into Asia, and really Asia first. A name you should know is Prince Henry the Navigator. He was not a navigator really, but rather a royal figure that funded exploration activities, and he's associated with things like the development of the Carrack, which quickly became, as it says there, the kind of main exploration ship. Remember, that was the smaller, more maneuverable one, had the lateen sail, the triangular sail, that kind of stuff. One thing the Portuguese were able to do beyond being the first to have the Carrack was also that they were the first to start mastering the wind patterns in the Atlantic Ocean, and this gave them an advantage that they used to really gain early dominance, not only in South Asia, but then also in Brazil, and also really into kind of South Central Africa. The Spanish were very, quick to follow them. 1492, of course, is a year that we've talked about a few times now in a few different ways as importance. Just 2 years later is when Spain and Portugal divided the world in half, and basically Spain got everything kind of from this line here over to like here, kind of, but the Philippines were in the Portuguese section, and then part of Brazil was in the Spanish section, but Portugal got everything in here, basically, and that was so they weren't competing with each other. But what the Spanish is, the role of the Spanish as well, the role of the Spanish in this is really that they increase the volume of activity going back and forth, particularly between the Americas and Europe. And that really gets Europeans interested in what's going on there and the opportunity there, and brings in these other powers then to kind of join the party because of their ramping up of things. So the Portuguese were doing it in a smaller way, but the Spanish really kind of come in and colonize large sections of the Americas that still show a very clear Spanish influence through this day. The Dutch are the next one to know. Remember that they were less a colonizer and more an innovator. Also, as we're going to talk about, one kind of complicated thing is, for the early part here, the Dutch were under Spanish control, so that also influences kind of the way we look at this time. Remember, the Dutch just means the Netherlands. You might hear it as Holland as well. It's just a territory, the largest territory within the Netherlands. Some innovations of theirs were the Vloot ship, which was that ship that allowed them to transport a lot more stuff a lot more cheaply. and also financial innovations like joint stock companies that allowed people to pool their resources together without taking all of the risk of losing everything on a transoceanic voyage that could very well sink. So it allowed much more and more of this stuff to kind of take place, and also increase the power of companies, and then sort of kind of taking power, in a sense, away from the state in a way that we would then see later on and through this day continues in kind of big ways. The English or the British are next. Remember, Britain is just England plus Scotland plus Wales. So they started just 5 years after the Spanish, but not very successfully at first. Henry Hudson is a name you should know, although he wasn't really around very long. He had his first voyage in 1607 in the Americas, but then 4 years later was mutinied by his crew and probably died, but we don't know for sure. They started colonizing around that same time, but weren't very successful at first. But after Hudson's voyages and the mapping he did, that allowed future success to happen for them. And then France actually ends up surrendering Canada to them, and the Mississippi River Basin actually doesn't go to Britain. That goes to Spain at first, but eventually to Britain later on. And that's all part of the 7 Years' War, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. So I'll kind of breeze past that because I'm going to talk about that. France was, just like the Dutch and English, all three of them were trying to find a way to Asia, really, to India, around the Spanish and Portuguese influence. So they were trying to find a way to get there without having to deal with the Spanish and the Portuguese. None of them were very successful in this, but it ended up obviously leading to other things that did benefit all of these groups, pretty much entirely all of them, yeah. Also remember, and I'm going to talk about this as we go through the kind of conflict history of Europe here in a second, but the French were kind of at a disadvantage. They had had a huge amount of death in the period just preceding this, so ending in 1453 was the 100 Years' War, and between that and the plague, 50% of people had died, and so they were just in a disadvantage for a couple reasons, even beyond that we're going to talk about. But they got going later is the point. You can see it's 30, 40 years later that they really started their exploration. But their colony was actually, their first colony in North America was before the British. And by 1624, they were not colonizing, but establishing trading posts in Africa. And when we talk about in the next part of this class after winter break, their presence in colonization of Africa is going to be very important. So this is all completely new stuff now. I thought it probably merited just going kind of down a chronology of major conflicts. And I mean, when I say major conflicts, I'm really only hitting the highlights. I would encourage you to just Google either France list of wars, or Spain list of wars, or England list of wars, and pull up the Wikipedia page, and you'll just scroll down and be amazed at how much conflict was going on. There was there's a whole list of a series of wars called the Anglo-Spanish Wars, and then of course there's Anglo-Portuguese Wars, and every single group had a series of wars against each other. So there's way too much to cover here, and honestly you don't need to know all of them. But I wanted to hit some of the highlights and kind of talk about some kind of turning point events or things that set the stage for the results that we're talking about, because we're focusing a lot on the results but not how we kind of got there. So the first, and I just mentioned this, is the 100 Years' War, and that was actually 117 Years' War. And when I show you who the belligerents were on both sides, this doesn't mean these were the only people involved. It means they were the main people involved, essentially. So basically who was fighting here was France and Spain together versus England and Portugal, more or less. Now, that was really a battle for control of France because England had a territorial control through lineages of kings, basically. But they lost, and they were not successful in that, and France became an independent thing, or continued being an independent thing, really, is more accurate to say. But that's a turning point, because that basically establishes you're there, England, we're here, France, we're different things, we're separate things. To an extent, there would be more fighting over this eventually, but more or less that's when that happens. 1453 should also stand out as an important year to you guys, because that's when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, and that's the end of the Byzantine Empire, and really the end of the Roman Empire, if you kind of consider them then the eastern half of that. So It's not to say then that between 1453 and 1580 there wasn't conflict. Again, there was all kinds of tiny conflicts going on, but I'm trying to hit the highlights here. So the next real kind of big turning point, at least in the scale of what we're talking about here to me, is Spain conquering Portugal, and that's the start of the Iberian Union, which lasted for 60 years. So that's a 60-year period where all of Iberia was under Spanish control, and so all that was the Portuguese Empire was now the Spanish Empire as well, or was the Iberian Empire, I guess you would say. But my point is, it was under the kind of one banner. The next big conflict, and a lot of these are years. There's ones on here that, by the way, there's ones that I didn't cover. There's other like X number of years wars. But the 30 Years' War was really fought between France and the Dutch, and then the Habsburgs, which were really German-Austrian kind of monarchy I'm going to talk about in a second, and Spain. And those two end up being allied, as I'm going to talk about in a second, under the kind of banner of the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire. So that war ends with the Peace of Westphalia, where Dutch and Swiss states are actually recognized for the first time. So before this point, the Dutch were under really the control of the Spanish Habsburgs. And so they were really under the control of the Spanish. And so they wanted to be their own independent Dutch republic, and at the end of this is when they're officially recognized. Now, they say they begin, I think, in 1619, I think is when technically their republic begins. But in 1648, the people, the Spanish leaders that said they were in control of that, recognized the Dutch as a republic, as well as the Swiss, I can't remember what the name was, but whatever the Swiss state was is what would become Switzerland. And there was some peace after this, but still kind of tiny battles going on here and there. The next one I think you should know about is the Battle of Vienna. That's when the Ottomans tried to take over Vienna, so they tried to continue conquering more of Europe, and they failed. And then there was basically a invasion of Ottoman Hungary then by European forces. And so that's a turning point because it basically marks the stopping point of that incursion into Europe. In a similar way that we talked about the Battle of Tours in France being the edge of the Moorish inclusion through Iberia into Western Europe. This is through Central or kind of Eastern Europe, basically. It's the same kind of deal. It's the end of that incursion, the start of the movement backwards of Europeans then taking back control of Europe, essentially. That was mostly done in that 15-year period that follows, you see there, by the Holy League, which is an alliance of Poland, the Habsburgs, Russia, and Venice. All of them against the Ottomans, who had, at this point controlled a big chunk of Eastern Europe, like we talked about. So they had a whole series of concurrent wars going on where, when you look at it, it's kind of no wonder the Ottomans would have not been able to succeed because they're having to fight wars on so many fronts. But during that period, then you started having mostly the Habsburgs and really kind of the Poland-Lithuanian alliance start taking back over Eastern Europe, essentially. The next conflict you should know about is the 9 Years' War, and that was like France basically versus everyone. And what I mean by everyone is that's France versus Spain, Portugal, England. I think by now, I don't know what we were calling Germany at this point, but it would have been under that Habsburg monarchy kind of banner. But either way, all the major European powers against France, and it was being fought not only in Europe, but also in North America and in India, because remember, France and England were trying to basically take control of India. So that was really the first global war that happened, was in 1688 to 1697. 1701 to 1714 is an important one to know. That was a brief period of time where France and Spain tried to basically merge into one larger state, and the other European powers weren't having it. And so that alliance was defeated in 1714. And then lastly, for some reason, that one's a longer dash. I don't know why, but I'll fix that. The 7 Years' War, where really nothing changed in Europe, but a lot of things changed. This is what I talked about earlier about France losing their possessions in North America. A lot changed in the Americas and in India. But the people fighting there was an alliance of Britain, Germany, and Portugal against France, the Habsburgs, and Russia, Spain, and the Mughals. So a big kind of alliance on the other side. And the result was that France lost Canada to Britain. They lost the Louisiana and the Mississippi River Delta, some of that to Britain, but most of that to Spain, actually. and Spain lost Florida to Britain. So multiple things kind of changed hands in the end of that, and also the Mughals lost most of the rest of their territory. Remember that they've had their conflict with the Marathas. They lost most of what they were controlling to Britain, and they were allied with France, and France lost most of its influence in India, and kind of from that point onward won't really have much influence in India. So this shows you Europe at the kind of start of the period and at the end of the period. And you can see that the main kind of, I guess, huge change is the breakup, and it's not entire, by the way, so that the Holy Roman Empire would exist until 1806. So it still did exist, but it was not what it was. And kind of at the end of this period, you have the replacement of that empire, which was really under the Habsburg kind of dominance, with this Prussian state. But I mean, it's not to say that they wouldn't still have dominance. Their dominance is going to kind of shift down, and then you're going to have this new Prussian state that we're going to learn more about as we kind of get into the next section. Italy at the start of this is actually controlled by, half of it basically is controlled by Spain, and the northern part is really in that alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. So Italy doesn't really even kind of exist. But by the end of this, is starting to kind of. Iberia looks more like what it's going to look like. France, Great Britain, all of these things are really taking their modern forms by the time we get to this. And you can see the Ottoman Empire, which had at one point kind of been up into here, and like I said, was trying to further kind of their influence, found themselves fighting an alliance of Venice, the Habsburgs, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Coalition, and the Russians over here. So they found themselves really kind of fighting multiple fronts, which was not good for them. The Holy Roman Empire, this is one that should, you should remember this. We talked about this back in Unit 3. But they controlled most of Central Europe from the Middle Ages to 1806, as you see there. That map shows you how the empire kind of grew and then shrunk. It declined really after the Napoleonic Wars started. It declined well before that, so it had been in decline for centuries. But the Napoleonic War started in 1803. I'm not going to talk about them much now because that's, again, the next unit. But that is kind of the event that starts the beginning of the end where they're officially kind of gone. Charles V, who was Charles I of Spain, but becomes Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor, was a Habsburg king, so he was part of House of Habsburg, so those are kind of one and the same. And you'll see that the time overlaps quite a bit, so when we're talking about one or the other, we're kind of talking about both usually. But Charles V is important to know because he led over all the Spanish expansion that was going on over this time period into the Americas and also during the Reformation. So like I said, the time frames for these two overlap quite a bit. The Habsburgs start when a German king takes over Austria, not through military conquest, but through marriage. It wasn't through his marriage, it was through the marriage of one of his sons. But anyway, in 1282 is when that happened. And then they really just start growing from there. So you can see there's a pretty big period of time where there was a 25-year gap, or it was a 20 to 30-year gap basically in this period of time. And it was, I think, from the 1740s to the 1760s, sometime in there, where the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a Habsburg. But outside of that, they had complete control over this. Now, this wasn't their main source of power. Their main source of power was being in control of really all of the yellow that you see here. And that's what this map from Wikipedia is really good, because it shows you, and I used this when I talked about France being surrounded, but this shows you the Spanish Habsburgs, which were the red, and then the Austrian Habsburgs, which were the yellow, and how they really just had France surrounded. And that was part of the kind of pressure on France that I was talking about, not really helping them kind of thrive early on. So that this right here that you see is when they come from the period basically of Charles V, and then kind of it splits again into two. So there's only a brief period of time when this is under one banner, but that's under Charles V. But they controlled a lot of it. And they would be in power, granted not of all of this. So by the end of this, we're just talking about Austria-Hungary, basically. But they're in power, the Habsburgs are in power all the way until 1918, until World War I. So we're going to be talking about them still through the next unit and beyond. So this again should look familiar, but I just want to touch on a couple major empires of East Asia, the Ming, which you should know about by now, and then the Qing that replaced them. and then the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. Remember, from all of the Qing and most of the Ming time and during most of the Tokugawa shogunate, they embraced an isolationist stance with the world. In other words, they do not let outsiders in, more or less, or if they do, they're under very strict restrictions. And the goal was to not have these cultures coming in and basically taking over their home country. So that was the point of embracing these stances. But these were two other groups to know about in that time. And kind of, again, remember, all the pink stuff is the CED stuff. So anything that you see pink is very likely stuff you're going to see not only on the test this week, but also on the test in May. So that's why I highlight it for you. In the Indian Ocean, these are just some groups to know about. Again, I'm just kind of reviewing now some of the CED stuff so you have it kind of at the front of your mind. But these are 4 groups that they want you to know that we're interacting with Europeans, but we're kind of well-established groups by the time the Europeans arrived. So you should know about the Swahili Arabs in the Swahili coast of East Africa. You should know about the Omanis, which are kind of at the southern and eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula. You should know about the Gujaratis, which are in western India. Did I say India? I meant Arabia there. I just thought I might have said India. But anyway, so the Omanis are in the Arabian Peninsula on the southern and eastern side. The Gujaratis are on the western side of India. And then the Japanese were the major group, and actually still are one of the major groups in Indonesia, controlling the Spice Islands, Strait of Malacca, kind of all of these really important islands there. So those are just 4 that you need to know. It's not to say they were the only ones, but they are 4 that the College Board has singled out as ones to know. Just in a similar way, there's 2 major states that they want you to know that are relevant in this unit because we're talking about interaction with Europeans. So the Asante Empire and the Kingdom of Congo were 2 that had very large trade relationships with Europeans and became very wealthy, prosperous states in their time because of their interactions with Europeans. You should, of course, know about the Songhai as well. We talked about them. But those, again, I just want to kind of remind you of some of these because, again, these are the kind of things you'll be seeing on the test this week and also in May. This I put in the other slides too. I just like to put it here so that way you can kind of, at any point here, if you're going through these slides and want to put something in context relative to something else, basically, that can kind of help you out. Like, I think it's kind of nice to know that, okay, well, so the Portuguese empire, meaning kind of almost the kind of trading empire, and the Spanish trading empire, they're well in existence before the Qing dynasty exists. So it's just kind of interesting to know. So when they start this, and when the Portuguese arrive at the start, they're actually interacting with the Ming. And remember, the Portuguese had interactions with the Japanese that then lead to that isolationist stance, which actually that's what that is. So right here is where the isolationism begins, okay? And you can see that if it lines up kind of roughly shortly after when the Manchu, those aren't related events. I'm just saying, putting them in time next to each other, like, all of this is happening after the Songhai already gone. So we're talking about these things at the same time because they're roughly in the same time period, but it's probably worthwhile for you to understand that, no, that at this point they were gone. So anyway, I just like to put it there for you to use in that way, and so I thought I'd talk you through what the point of it is in being there. So now we're getting into the key kind of concepts from the CED pages. A lot of this, again, will be review, and that's because it's a review session, and because we're doing more of these kind of slides in class, it kind of is leaning that way, unfortunately, but we'll see. I was kind of thinking through how I might want to rethink through the weekend session idea now that we're moving in this direction, but we'll figure that out in the new year. I'm not too concerned about that. So again, just a reminder that all of this is rooted in the CED and these themes, and I would encourage you to use these themes to organize your studying, to organize your notes around these, because they allow you to kind of see the common threads that exist between these different stories, basically, as we go through them. So for 4.5, this one, remember, was a very big unit, so it's going to be broken up into multiple parts. The first part to know, or the first thing to understand, is that European rulers embraced financial innovations to consolidate and maintain their power. Now, this should kind of ring a bell if we think back to Unit 3, and we were talking about the use of things like art and things like grand architecture to consolidate and legitimize wealth for them. In a similar way, European rulers now were using this to consolidate and kind of maintain their power. So they didn't really need legitimacy at this point. They needed to kind of grow and then kind of keep control of that which they grew. Now, all of this is rooted again in a word that you need to know, which is mercantilism. And that's an economic theory that basically sees the supply of global stuff as finite, and so therefore dictates that everyone needs to go out and get as much of that stuff as they can before your rivals do, otherwise you'll be at a significant disadvantage that could lead to your people being conquered entirely, essentially. So the only reason I say it that way is so you understand that this is rational behavior. It's not like they were just greedy jerks. That may be the way it kind of seems, and certainly was the way it manifested, but it was rooted in this idea that if they didn't, other people were going to, and so they needed to go out and compete, essentially. All that competition, though, leads to rivalries, but of course, beyond conflict, those rivalries led to some innovations. Some innovations, again, that should make sense to you as review are things like joint stock companies, which, as I said before, were a way that people could pool their wealth together by buying a share of a company instead of buying the entire voyage. And this allowed them to kind of pool their resources together without taking on all of the risk. Because before this point, if you wanted to fund some sort of transoceanic voyage, you had to take on all of that risk yourself. And if that went bust, if that ship sunk, your entire life could sink with it, essentially. And so it wasn't very attractive for people to kind of do that. Another thing that you need to kind of understand, and we talked about this in class as well, is that the trade that was going on in the Indian Ocean when the Europeans arrived was well established. It had been going on, as it says there, for over 1,000 years before the Portuguese. Remember, they're the first ones to get there, and others aren't going to really be there for a while, the best part of 100 years. So all of this was very well established. There was a huge amount of Muslim influence because of the kind of Muslim majorities in a lot of parts of here, or at least the Muslim rule in like India, where it wasn't Muslim majority, but they were still under Muslim leaders. The point is they entered a well-established Muslim-dominated world, essentially. They did disrupt this world. They did eventually take control over some areas, some shipping lanes. Eventually, they would start colonizing, as we talked about. So eventually, that disruption would grow. But at least initially, they were just like another player in an existing game that was going on. Their role increasing, and they're taking over of power in this kind of trade network is one of the fronts of the Muslim-European rivalry that's going on. You have the territorial front being the kind of incursions into Iberia and also the Ottomans into East Asia. But this is another area where that rivalry then kind of expands. One example from the CED that we've talked about on kind of both sides now. We talked about this from the Songhai Empire's perspective, and now we're talking about it as like an economic conflict, is the Songhai-Morocco conflict. That was over control of the gold and salt trade in West Africa, where the Moroccans came down to basically take over after the Songhai were starting to collapse. So again, this was rational behavior. This wasn't the Moroccans having specific beef with the Songhai. They just needed this trade to continue, and the empire that was there was starting to have some problems. And so they chose to use that opportunity to eventually, as you see, not initially successfully, but eventually take over. But then shortly after, they themselves would fall into a period of civil war and instability. This conflict is also noteworthy because the Moroccans were vastly outnumbered. The Songhai army was much, much larger, but the Moroccans were using gunpowder, which by now should stand out as something of interest to you. The next thing to talk about are continuities and changes in the global networks of exchange that existed in this time. And remember that this is an example where continuities and change tend to be a little bit blurry. And the emergence of triangular trade in the Atlantic Ocean is just a continuation of the expansion of trade networks. However, it's also a change because it's the coming into existence of a brand new thing, right? So triangular trade refers to the movement of raw materials. So we're talking about cash crops and also food from the Americas to Europe, manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, and enslaved human beings to grow those raw materials or to harvest them or to mine for them if it's silver from Africa to the Americas. 3 specific labor markets that grew that were existing labor markets that grew because of the new kind of global trade that was going on, the expanded global trade that was going on that you need to know are in Western Europe. There was wool and linen, India, cotton and textiles, and China being silk. Okay, and these are things that, again, shouldn't be new to you. This is review going back to the last unit even, or probably previous units. But the point is that these existing kind of specialized industries that existed in these regions expanded because they now had larger global markets that wanted their products. So it was good for business, but it also meant they needed more workers. And so that was a mix of skilled and unskilled, as we'll talk about. So some of the commercial innovations that would come about as a result of all of this change beyond the joint stock companies were also chartered monopolies, which were given to some of those joint stock companies. And I talked about this in class, that it really makes sense because I know that we look today as like monopolies being inherently bad, and that's pretty accurate. And even here, they weren't exactly great. But when you consider the tremendous amount of risk these companies were engaged in, they almost needed the monopoly status to be able to justify the risk of what they were doing, engaging in trade in a faraway land with pretty poor technology, essentially. Remember, all this influx of wealth that came back was not necessarily a good thing. The Spanish had control of the silver trade, and that led to runaway inflation because they had no type of price controls. So basically, wealth poured back in, people were able to buy way more stuff than could be produced, and so the price of everything went up, and so suddenly everyone wasn't actually wealthy. Remember, too, that if you weren't engaged in one of these trade practices that brought new wealth your way, all you received were increased prices. So your standard of living actually declined. But, as we just talked about, a lot of people were able to take advantage of that new kind of global shipping service that emerged to be able to trade their goods with larger sections and farther away sections of the world. So people did benefit, but at the same time, it created significant challenges for people kind of living in this time. Here are some examples of some of those chartered monopoly companies. You don't need to know any of them specifically, but I think it's kind of interesting to see where they are, and obviously there's a huge amount of overlap in terms of where they are to where the European powers were existing, essentially. So the Dutch had a significant influence in through here, and a little bit in Brazil, but obviously the Portuguese have most of the dominance there. The British East India Company having control over a lot of India, for instance, shouldn't surprise anyone. You can see that everyone basically engaged in these things, so that there was a French as well, but the Dutch and the British were the two that really were kind of the leaders in this, and you can see that they're more heavily represented accordingly, so it kind of makes sense. Is the last one of 4.5. So this one's kind of got 2 parts. First is to understand how political, economic, and cultural factors affected societies, and the other is to explain how systems of belief kind of influence each other, interacted with each other. And the kind of point to make here is that you had this rapid expansion of groups interacting with each other in a way that they hadn't before. And I mean, when I say groups, I mean very different groups. I don't mean the Spanish and the French, who were different, but let's face it, had some similarities. I'm talking about really indigenous peoples in the Americas, Africans who were moved against their will, enslaved Africans, and Europeans, and this is happening in the Americas. And then in Asia, you also had not only the groups, the indigenous groups to South Asia and Southeast Asia, but then you also had a huge Muslim influence, as we talked about, particularly through trade, and now you have Europeans coming in as well. So in different parts of the world, you have very different cultures now interacting in a much larger way, in a much quicker way than we had seen in the past. So even when we talked about kind of the global trade networks, even in the part 1 of the class, it was mostly the idea that like you had individuals going along a trade route out there kind of paving a new path or charting a new course for their religion or for what they were trading or for whatever it might have been. But sorry, I didn't mean to hit that actually. But at this time, what you had was large migrations of people, and that's where you end up having the kind of interactions of societies in a more kind of concentrated way that brings about some examples of syncretism. While we're here, I just want to mention Sikhism again. I talked about it in the last unit, but Sikhism is an example of almost syncretism, or has some syncretic elements. But what needs to be understood here is that from a Sikh's perspective, for someone who is a Sikh, they would say, no, well, my religion is a unique thing unto its own, and sure, it has some influence from the people that were around it at the time it came into existence, but that's true of anything anywhere. But if you just go do a Google search, you would see, oh, Sikhism is an example of syncretism. So this is where these things aren't exactly clear and the lines are kind of blurry. But all syncretism is, and it's a term you need to know, is the merging or attempted merging, that's all amalgamation means, of different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. And so the reason some people would say Sikhism is syncretic is because there appear to be some Muslim traditions and some Hindu traditions that are included in that. And like I said, that makes sense, but from a Sikh's perspective, their religion kind of is separate to the fact that, yeah, they do share some cultural elements with the dominant cultures in India at the time in which the religion came into existence, but that's not necessarily the religion, that's just a reality of the time and place, essentially. So that's, anyway, all I'm trying to say is these lines aren't exactly clear, but when you're thinking of syncretism, there are some more specific examples, which you'll see on the slides, which you should think of. I put all these maps together on one slide just to kind of consolidate it down, but the point I want to make here, and it's kind of summarized here, and I really struggle for what word to use here. Like I had ambition, I had rivalry, and I landed at mercantilism because I think that that's the thing that really drove all of this. But European mercantilism completely changes West Africa because you have the outflux of people in such a huge way, particularly during the 18th century, to a lesser extent during the 19th century. And then remember, it shifts, the center of gravity shifts from truly West Africa to kind of West Central Africa. The depopulation of people from this region had a huge social effect that we're going to talk about. And I really like this chart that really lays out the fact that probably about 24 million people were taken against their will in total. All right. The population at the middle of the 19th century, so pretty recent, was about 100 million. And it would have been about twice that had these 24 million still been there and been able to kind of reproduce as humans normally do. They likely would have had twice the population. And when we get into the next unit, we talk about all of the colonization that went on in Africa. You have to, I want you to keep this in your mind because it's like without this piece, without this significant depopulation, just like we talked about in the Americas, it's hard to imagine the Europeans having as much success as they did because there would have been more people to fight back against that. Okay, so we're talking about significant demographic changes in West Africa, mostly men, so that led to changes in West African society like polygyny, men having multiple wives, but also increased power for women, some new female elite groups essentially come into existence. And then the migration of Africans to the Americas, like I said, is what then kind of fed in to some of that syncretism that we're going to talk about right down here. So as Europeans spread, of course, their religion and languages did too. This shows you Christians in the Americas, which I just think are an indicator of that Spanish influence, essentially, in the Americas. As it spread, it came into conflict, of course, with the local religions, but sometimes they merged. Remember, no worries, you're all good. This will be posted, so you can watch it if you need to. Sorry, I just kind of lost my train of thought there. I got derailed. Oh yeah, so as Christianity kind of starts making its way to the Americas, one thing to understand is that the kind of institutions of church didn't necessarily come with them and didn't necessarily all kind of manifest in the Americas. So people were kind of left to their own devices. And as a result of that, people started basically making up their own religions, or at least their own practices. And remember, you had different groups together now. So in the Americas, you had indigenous groups, African groups, and European groups now, all kind of merging some ideas together. And some examples of syncretism that you should know are things like Voodoo, Santeria, and Candomblé. So this is 4.6 now. So 4.5 is a really big one. The rest of these are actually fairly quick. And my goal here was for this to be a little bit shorter because when combined with the first part of Unit 4, you know, I don't want there to be 3 hours of stuff for you to watch. That's a little ridiculous. So 4.6 is all about the challenges that emerged to state power during this time. And those challenges were both internal and external. You had resistance movements from enslaved peoples. You had resistance movements of poor peoples. You had resistance movements of nobility. So you had all different kinds of groups vying for power and different resistance movements kind of growing as states start growing and as the power of the state starts growing, essentially. Some of those revolts, by the way, these are in revolts of enslaved peoples. Those happened across the Americas, the Caribbean, and even into Asia as well. So one example, this was a revolt of the nobility in France, was the Fronde. It was a series of conflicts between 1648 and 1653. And it was basically an uprising incited by the nobility class, which didn't like kind of the moves toward a more kind of absolutist stance among the government. And so they fought back against that, and they were ultimately defeated. Now, they did this at the early stages of Louis XIV's life, and really the early stages of his rule, when he wasn't really in control, but this gentleman here, Cardinal Mazarin, was. And so that then influences the way Louis XIV would come to rule, because he would embrace a more kind of absolutist stance against them, because they tried to basically overthrow him when he was a kid. In Spain, you had a successful revolt for a brief period of time against actually in Spain, well, in the Americas, you had a successful, for a brief period of time, revolt against the Spanish by the Pueblos allied with the Apaches in and around Santa Fe. They had a kind of a revolt where they killed 400 people, drove the rest of them out, and for 12 years they were in control. At the end of that 12-year period, the Spanish reconquered that area, but they did abandon really the harshest elements of their rule. They tried to embrace Pueblo society and bring the Pueblos into Spanish society a little bit more and kind of intertwine more than the kind of more brutal posture that they had taken the first time around. And so it's not to say that that was a direct result of this, but it does kind of stand to reason that the Spanish took a different approach the second time around. I mentioned earlier the Maratha-Mughal conflict. Remember, the Marathas were a Hindu warrior group. They end up taking over most of India from the Mughals, and then they're going to be in charge until they're ultimately kind of defeated by the British East India Company. Remember what I said earlier, though, during the same time, toward the end of that, is when you had the Mughals allied with the French end up having to cede other territory to the British. So that then gives the British kind of more power in the subcontinent and leads then to the British further expansion when they fully take over the rest and defeat the Marathas. But this was another conflict between kind of groups in the time that, I mean, this was an internal group, of course, but it ends up kind of taking over the entire thing. The Cossacks were another not successful revolt group. They were a warrior peasant group, or kind of different groups of people from the steppes of Central Asia. That's the green area here. It's kind of highlands. And the Russian nobles treated them pretty poorly. Many of them were so poor they basically became de facto slaves in this kind of serfdom that persisted in Russia all the way through Catherine the Great's time and beyond. And so between 1773 and 1775, there was a revolt among the Cossacks. They were not successful. And as a result of that, as a result of their unsuccessful revolt, they actually ended up getting treated worse. And that was kind of true almost of every one of these revolts that ends up getting quashed. Metacom, who was also King Philip from the English perspective, he led a group of kind of an alliance of tribes in New England against the settlers, against the British settlers that were there. They attacked half the towns and destroyed a few of them. Some of the groups, though, and I do want to highlight it there, some of the groups did side with the English, so it wasn't just indigenous versus English, kind of in the way that the battles existed. But the result was that his people ended up losing pretty much all of their land. So again, you can see a lot of these results were a lot of the revolts were not successful, but they were kind of in response to the growing power. Like, these indigenous groups chose to band together because they saw the British as a growing force in their area and felt the need to fight back against it. This should make more sense now, having done your DBQ activity with the documents that you saw. There were multiple allusions to the kind of growing power of the British in the Americas and how that unsettled a lot of the indigenous groups. So remember, Portugal lost a lot of its, it lost its influence in South Asia. It retained its influence in South America, obviously in Brazil, but it also retained its influence in a lot of Africa, particularly in kind of Central Africa. And so Queen Ana Nzinga is another person you should know. She was initially a Portuguese ally, but ends up allying with the Dutch and fighting back against them. She briefly wins independence for her kingdoms. In addition to Ndonga, who she took over initially, there was a second kingdom she ended up being in charge of as well. And so she won independence for both of them in 1657. But you see there, just 14 years later, sorry, my math is terrible. 14 years later, at least one of the two of those kingdoms was reabsorbed by Portugal. So there was success, but it was very short-lived. In the Americas, obviously there was success in terms of the ultimately the abolition of slavery, but we could argue about the ongoing effects, of course, and whether or not success is a correct way to frame that. But all of that was rooted in acts of rebellion that start during this time. And so those acts of rebellion were not just enslaved people, but oftentimes they were enslaved people who were allied with indentured servants who were usually white. And so there were more than 250 of them between the 17th and 19th centuries. You don't need to know any specific ones. I talked about this in class, but it does merit kind of knowing the order of some of them and kind of more than anything, the fact that it was a growing trend that was leading toward the abolition movements that would kind of follow. You need to know what maroon societies are. Maroons are just formerly enslaved people that successfully escaped their slavery. So this is just kind of a story example to talk you through what one of them is. So in 1655, England took control over Jamaica from the Spanish, and Queen Nanny was an enslaved African who was brought to Jamaica during that time. And she was from kind of modern-day Ghana. She was sold into slavery by the Asante Empire, the empire we mentioned before. And she fled, ends up becoming a leader, and wins, again, a brief period. It was not a long period, a brief period of success against the English rule in Jamaica. But you don't need to know her as a specific example, but you need to know that these societies emerged all through the Americas and the Caribbean, where a specific kind of group would basically be able to just escape and create their own little society in hiding. If you did during the People of Unit 4 activity, one of the options was another Maroon society in the Americas. So there were quite a few of them. Hers wasn't the only one. So 4.7, this is where I've started adding some stuff back in that I kind of wanted to expand on some stuff. But remember, your learning objective here is to be able to explain continuity and change in the social categories, roles, and practices that existed between 1450 and 1750. And the crux of this is that some of the groups were nice to the groups they were controlling, some of the empires were nice to the groups they were controlling, and some of them were not so nice. And that's basically the kind of storyline. And then beyond that, the elites that existed in each area found themselves in different positions, or it's more fair to say new elites came into existence while old elites found their influence waning. So some examples of exclusion that you need to know. 1492, again, an important year to kind of stick in your head. was not only Columbus, was not only Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, but was also the year that Spain expelled Jewish people. And this was immediately following the Reconquista. So this was kind of a part of that same movement to Christianize Iberia, and so they wanted anyone that wasn't Christian to be gone, essentially. So their choice that they gave to the Jewish people that were living there was either to convert or leave. Many did leave. We'll talk about them in a second. The Manchu, despite the fact that I talked about, this was in Unit 3, how the Qing dynasty really did kind of embrace a lot of the Ming, or the ethnic Han, really, governing traditions and Confucianism and some of their kind of culture, they did kind of seek to impose their own cultural superiority on the ethnic Han people. One way they did that was with the Q haircut, which was where the front of the head was shaved and the back was grown into a ponytail. That was mandatory, and if men didn't do that, they were executed. So that's an example of some of the restrictive policies they put on the Han to basically, eventually the goal would have been to merge them into their own society and make them not see themselves as different, to really kind of get rid of that resentment, if nothing else. In the Americas, of course, indigenous and enslaved peoples were treated very poorly by the Europeans, and so that's certainly an example of exclusion, and worse, really. So in the Muslim world, you did have some good examples of inclusion. The Ottomans, as I said in class, welcomed the expelled Jewish people from Iberia, and they made good contributions to Ottoman society in the areas of science, business, and finance. They were also tolerant of Christians and allowed them to continue practicing their religion. It is worth noting that the Ottomans did keep charging the jizya, the kind of mandatory, not mandatory, but the prescribed tax in Islam for non-Muslim kind of subjects. Devshirme I just brought up as an example, and I talked about this in class, how that started as a pretty brutal practice. It started as basically the kidnapping of Christian children for the kind of military and bureaucratic elite in Ottoman society. But over time, as Christians kind of embrace their status as Ottoman subjects and are being treated relatively well by the Ottomans, eventually families want their children to be part of this. And eventually it becomes kind of a thing that they're proud of. In the Mughal Empire, you had them really embracing Hindus and Sikhs, bringing them into government. Remember, this wasn't a Muslim majority area that they were in charge of. So these were Muslims leading a non-Muslim majority, and so that of course influenced the way they approached things. They actually went as far as not charging that tax to non-Muslims. So that's an example of kind of the inclusion or the good treatment of other groups that was going on at the time. All of these are CED new elite groups that you need to know that emerged during this time. So of course the Qing dynasty is a new group of elites that emerged in the Manchu Empire. Well, let me back this up. They already existed, so there already was the kind of ethnic Jurchen people who were the Manchus, kind of one and the same, although it's like a further distillation, essentially. So Manchu's a bigger umbrella that includes the Jurchens as kind of the main group or the leading group of that. They had an elite group, they had elite classes, but as they took over China and controlled, you know, the huge empire that was China and became the Qing dynasty, there was a new status for those elites, and of course the number of elites changed. But also you had the changing of native-born versus born in China elites as well. And it's kind of similar to what goes on in the Americas. But eventually it kind of becomes a distinguishing point about the Qing elite that were born in China versus the ones that were born in what would be called Manchuria, up to the north. Remember, in West Africa, you had kind of a growing class of kind of women elites in some areas as a result of the slave trade and the disproportionate movement of men. In the Ottoman Empire, you had also a growing role for women, as women who were either wives or concubines of the sultans basically vied for their sons to have more political influence, because more or less the more political influence their sons could have, and to an extent the men they were in relationships as well with, But the more they could have kind of proximity to power, the more power they would have. So you had the emergence of what was called harem politics. You had new elite groups in the Americas, which I'm going to talk about in a second, so I won't mention them here. And then again, of course, as you had these new companies and all of this new wealth that was being accumulated by these business people, you had new classes of commercial urban elites that emerged in Europe at this time. So now, again, we're going to go into some new stuff kind of to provide some context. Because to understand the changes that took place for the existing elites, you really need to understand what absolutism is. So absolutism is a political doctrine and the practice of that doctrine that the ruler, usually a king or a dictator, however you want to call it, has absolute power. In other words, they have complete power and what they say goes, and that's that, essentially. And so leaders across Eurasia, not just European leaders, but across Eurasia, started kind of embracing a more and more absolutist stance to the point of becoming completely absolute rulers. Some of them you should know, and most of these, in fact, all of these except probably Charles I, should be names that you recognize. So Louis XIV, we've talked about. He was, like I said before, the Fronde was in his childhood. So as he became king as an adult, he did not forget the fact that the nobles tried to overthrow him and use that to enforce a pretty brutal rule against them. Peter the Great more or less finishes the job of getting rid of the boyars, who I'm going to talk about in a second. Charles I was a king of England who embraced absolute rule to the extent that there was actually a civil war in England for a brief period of time, fell out of monarchy in response to how brutal his rule was. And Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire, and pretty much all of the Ottoman emperors to different extents had absolute rule, but some of them were more powerful or less powerful than the others. But what I would say is he was probably the most powerful, but what happens is as time goes on and there's more centralization of power and kind of more efficient bureaucracy of power, the later sultans in practice probably had more absolute power because they could exert it more. And that's where you have things like the Janissary Revolt that I've mentioned, that was 1806. You start having these groups in Ottoman society internally start revolting beyond all of the fighting that was going on between them and the Europeans. So the boyars were the highest level of nobility that existed in Russian society and really Eastern European societies throughout most of their early histories. The boyars go back to like the 9th century. So this is going back a long, long way. But they were a powerful group all the way through the end, at least, of the 17th century, as you can see there on the screen. But they were the land-owning elites, and they were the most powerful group except the Grand Prince, or the later called the Tsar. Remember, the Grand Prince was the Grand Prince of Kiev initially, and then the Grand Prince of Moscow. These were kind of the main leaders. And later on we'll call that position Tsar. So their loss in power starts, even to an extent, under Ivan the Great, because you just have larger consolidation of power under one banner, so there's always going to be a little bit of that. But it's really under Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, that you see kind of concerted efforts against them. So remember, when he, just like Louis XIV, when Ivan the Terrible was a child, he took power, basically. He took power as a child. For the first part of that time, his mother was really in charge, but the boyars were more or less plotting against him and trying to overthrow his power during this time because he was a child, and they did not like that, more or less. And so that, just like with Louis XIV, kind of stuck with him and leads to some pretty brutal treatment. He had been stripping power away from them, and then there was an effort to resist him toward the end of the 16th century. And that, you may remember the term Oporcina. That was his kind of secret police, basically, that did these raids, more or less, and kind of you did not want to be one of his enemies, essentially, because there was a secret police that could disappear you. Now, what's interesting is that's not very dissimilar to Russia today. So this kind of authoritarian streak in the way that things have been run in Russia has been present since the 16th century at least. You have this period after that. So this is just kind of after that period of Ivan the Terrible's rule, where you have the time of troubles. It was a period of chaos, basically lawlessness in Russia. And during that period, the boyars basically lost whatever power they had remaining. And so by this point, they're still nobles, but they're kind of nobles in a symbolic sense. And then under Peter the Great, there's even more reforms that not only, remember at this point, they don't have any like kind of real power, they just have symbolic power. And then under Peter the Great, he gets rid of that too. And so by the time of, by the time of his rule, they're basically powerless entirely. They still exist as a social class for, I think, another 100 years after that, but they're more or less kind of powerless. So, as it says there, the old elites changed. The boyars lost powers, the Tsars consolidated it. The same exact thing was going on in Europe, where you had kings actually taking power from their own nobilities. In the Ottoman Empire, you had the Janissaries, who I said actually revolted. That was an elite military group. They revolt in 1806, and kind of from before that period, but then after that period, definitely, they were losing power, and eventually they get replaced by a new Western-type military, and that was probably about 100 years after that revolt I mentioned. In China, remember, of course, you had the Han ethnic Chinese that found themselves now under Manchu rule, so that's an entire kind of overthrowing of the social elite class and being replaced by a new one. And then, of course, in the Americas and Africa and Asia, anywhere that you had Europeans influencing or interacting with local groups, the kind of fortunes of the elites in that area were very much basically toys of the European powers. So we talked before and in the DBQ about how the Bengalis, who allied themselves with the French, found themselves suddenly in a diminished status because the British won. And so the British came in, and now the people they had fought against were now in charge. And anywhere across Afro-Eurasia or in the Americas as well, I should say, across the world now, wherever the Europeans were colonizing and conquering, this same thing was kind of taking place. In the Americas, the social hierarchy system, in Spanish Americas, I should say, the social hierarchy system is called the casta system, very directly, obviously influenced by the caste system, even to the name. You had the Peninsulares, who were born in Iberia, born in Europe, the Creoles, who were born of European parents but not in Europe, and then from there you have kind of the mixing of groups, and then the kind of non-mixed indigenous and African groups down at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And of course, people that had some European blood were higher than them, and then the pure Europeans were higher still. And so the point here is that you had a full social hierarchy class system based on your ethnicity, based on race, essentially. And eventually, as we go into the next unit, this is going to become a sticking point for revolutions, because there's going to be conflict between the Peninsulares and the Creoles over power, because the Peninsulares, do see themselves as superior to the Creoles. And so that then creates a new layer of conflict that will kind of define the next chapter of the class. This doesn't fit in well particularly here, but it does have an impact, so that's why I want to talk about it, and I wanted to put it somewhere. So just remember, this is actually from, I think, 4.4, but there were these coerced labor systems that were used in the Americas, like the Mita, which was the Inca system that was adopted by the Spanish, the encomienda and hacienda systems, which were kind of feudal-like in different ways, although hacienda was more manorial. You had indentured servitude, where people came to the Americas and were essentially enslaved for a period of time, but at the end of that period of time were free to go. You had serfdom, which was less the case in the Americas, although in practice, the workers in the encomienda and hacienda systems were essentially serfs. But in the hacienda system, they were serfs with a bit of choice, I guess. But my point is that there kind of some overlap here. But just remember that serfdom kind of persisted in Europe because of the need for workers in the agricultural systems as you had growing populations. Remember, Columbian exchange, new crops come over, there's more people, there needs to be more food. So there's still a huge agricultural element of society. We're going to talk about how that's still the central part of the economy. And so that still needed a lot of workers. And so you had serfdom persist, particularly in Russia, all the way through the 1800s. The last system of course labor to know about is chattel slavery. That's the permanent system of enforced labor and ownership where people were seen as property and their children were too. That's what was used in the Americas. And remember that the kind of difference here is that the traditional system that existed in Africa did not see people in the same property way. They were still humans, they just were controlled humans. And their children were not usually seen as slaves. And so the way I said this in class and the way I would encourage you to think about this is that the people doing the purchasing, the Europeans purchasing these enslaved humans, had a very different understanding of what slavery was than the Africans they were buying them from. So yes, Africa had an existing system of slavery for quite a while before the Europeans ever thought about buying them. But the European understanding and the way the Europeans took the institution was in a very different direction. The reason I put these coerced labor systems here is because you need to understand that the influx of all of these enslaved people to the Americas and the imposition of a very clear social hierarchy system with kind of forced coerced labor systems as a part of that social hierarchy system. These two things are related. All of that together has a profound social impact on the Americas and the west coast of Africa. In other words, the social order of all of this and both of these continents is completely upended and changes because of these systems of labor. And that's why they get brought up here, because they're relevant, they're important to know. All right, this is the last one. This is the review topic. I did add a little bit in here too, I think, or at least one last one. But this is just kind of review, mostly actually from the first part of Unit 4. But just understand that all of these innovations, like all of this world-changing stuff we're talking about, is rooted in the innovations that started in really Europe at this time. But those innovations weren't born of European ideas. They were a mix of kind of the merging of classical, Islamic, and Asian knowledge, finding its way back into Europe or finding its way to Europe for the first time, and all merging and coming together to kind of create new things like new technologies and ship designs and navigational tools, better maps and charts, and better understanding of weather patterns and wind patterns and ocean patterns, all that. All of the stuff that allowed people to travel across the world in a predictable and safer manner, that allowed all of this to happen, is rooted in the movement of knowledge. That's the only point to take away from this. The next is that, as I said before, agriculture remains central to the global economy. Okay, it still is the main thing people are doing for work, but it starts changing. You have the emergence of plantation agriculture in the Americas, and the need for these labor systems to supply laborers for that system of agriculture. The Columbian Exchange leads to population booms all over the world, and as I talked about in class, those population booms lead to further job specialization and the emergence of new industries, because there were more people in more urbanized settings that did not need to spend all their time trying to find food or working toward the end of there being enough food, and so they could do other things. So you have the demand for labor growing in two different fronts. You have unskilled labor, essentially, although it is skilled, but we call it that, right? But we're talking about manual labor, farming and mining and that kind of stuff. And for those kind of jobs, that's where you had these systems of coerced labor and these basically communities of peasant communities or serf communities growing. Both of these were growing things in response to the need of these new industries or these growing industries. You also had the need for more kind of manufactured and specialized goods. That's some of those artisan kind of craft things I mentioned before, like textiles and cotton from India, silk from China, and linen and wool from Europe. Okay, all of these things required more skill, so there were more people needing to do those as well. That didn't mean that those were like very lucrative jobs necessarily, but they were a kind of a class above the more manual labor class below. And then, as I said before, the kind of movement of enslaved humans and the imposition of forced labor systems and a forced race-based social hierarchy in the Americas had a huge influence on the social systems in both the Americas and Africa for a long time to come. Last is to know that global empires were shaped by, and they shaped the diverse groups of people that they controlled. Some of the specific conflicts or rivalries you need to know about are all of that conflict I talked about before that was going on in Europe that I said was really a result of mercantilism. All of those fights, all of those territorial changes that I mentioned, all of that was rooted in mercantilism. All of it was rooted in the idea that we are the Spanish, we are competing against the Portuguese, the French, the English, the Germans, the Ottomans. We're competing against all these people, and there's only so much stuff. And if we don't go get it, they will. So that rivalry led to a huge amount of conflict. As I mentioned before, you had the Muslim-European rivalry that was not only in the Indian Ocean, but also in a territorial sense, happening between the Ottomans and the kind of Eastern Europeans and the Habsburgs, as we talked about them. Do remember the Morocco-Songhai conflict. I would be shocked if there's not at least one question on this on the AP test in May, because it's actually in multiple parts of the CED, so it's one they really do want you to know. And control over sea trade routes really across the world between Europeans, but also between Europeans and Muslims, is a huge example of this conflict. Other ones you should know about, just in kind of review, Maratha-Mughal conflict in India. Remember, that's more of a religious conflict, kind of, but it was really a political conflict with a religious layer to it. And then conflict in the Europeans between enslaved and indigenous peoples and their European kind of leaders or rulers in the Americas is one last final one. So this is the last thing I wanted to say, is just for you guys who are here and for anyone who watches this before the test. The test is entirely going to be from the CED. So in other words, even in these slides or in these presentations, I've gone through some stuff that is not specifically from the CED. That won't be in the test, okay? I really want to really kind of hone in on the CED and kind of make sure you guys are pulling at least the bare minimum from it. But the point is like any of the curriculum stuff you're going to be seeing has been covered in these slides. But stuff like the AP regions, the AP themes, the AP historical thinking skills, and the AP reasoning skills, those will be tested too, and I'm not going to cover those again because we've talked about them a lot in class. So those you will want to study on your own. I'm going to be adding this video, the video from earlier, both of these slide decks, as well as I think I need to put Unit 3 on there because I didn't put it as well, and a few other resources. I'll be putting all of these onto that review site. It will be posted officially, although it's up there now, you can see it. It will be officially posted Monday morning with, hey, get to work and study for the test, and that will be the asynchronous work for this week.